Quasi-experimental designs and developmental research. So let's take a look at these. So quasi-experimental designs, there's some limitations to these quasi-experimental designs. We call them quasi because they're not quite full of have all the conditions and the control features of the actual experimental design. So the control features that we have in the experimental design, like random selection and random assignment, right? And maybe controlling the independent variable, who gets the independent variable and when and what time and how much and how many. We can't do that. Those control features are out with quasi-experimental designs. So there's no randomization, the independent variable can't be manipulated, and unfortunately with those two things, internal validity can be compromised, so that it can have an effect on internal validity. And again, internal validity, even from our prior video from chapter 8, tells us that internal validity just means that we were carefully designed our studies and we carefully randomized our two different groups into experimental and control groups. So therefore, we know that the independent variable absolutely had an effect on the outcomes, that the IV had an effect on the dependent variable. It was not because of some other confound or extraneous variable, that we were very strategic in our methodology and we have internal validity. With quasi-experimental designs, just by the fact that we cannot randomly assign and select our two groups, we have a compromised internal validity, and we also have bias. We have bias because our two groups can only be chosen from existing natural groups that are there. Typically something like classroom A and classroom B, like, hey, Dr. Garcia is going to let us come and assess their her students in this particular class, and Dr. Fernando is going to allow us to go into her class and we can assess the students in that class. So typically it's a convenient sample. There's no random selection. There's no random assignment. And so unfortunately, since you don't have that, you basically have two groups who are chosen from existing natural groups. It's not the best situation, but a lot of times quasi-experimental designs is the majority of what many researchers are doing out there. But just know that it's biased. Now with quasi-experimental designs, there's a lot of different ways that you can design these. And even if you can't, since you can't randomly assign, sometimes you just have a single group of people. Maybe you're not having two different populations and you're randomly assigning them to two different groups. Sometimes researchers will do something called a one group post-test only design. One group here, again, you only have a single group. You just get one group of participants. You expose them to an independent variable. So let's say you have your participants, they're sitting on a bench, you have a confederate, they come and they sit down next to the stranger, right? A stranger sits down next to your participants, and the dependent variable might be to measure the length of time that a person stays and how long will it take for them to actually leave when a stranger sits down next to them. So now one of the limitations here again is that the comparison can only be made between this independent variable and the dependent variable. You don't have really two groups to compare anything with. You just have a single group, so there's no comparison. You're just really looking at, well, when somebody sits down next to a stranger, how long does it take for them to leave? So you're really only making a comparison between these two experiences, and that's it. Now with the one group pre-test, post-test design, this is kind of another elevated level. And again, we see one group because it's only a single group of participants. You haven't randomly selected from the population. You have not randomly assigned people into two different groups. But in this case, you have that pre-test, post-test condition. So you have a dependent variable or the pretest. So in this case, the researchers are trying to understand whether or not a smoking cessation training program is effective. In other words, we're going to get you to stop smoking. And they want to see if this intervention for smoking cessation is effective. So here's what they can do is they can get all participants who are smokers, just a single group of all participants who are smokers, measure them on their smoking measure, things like how many cigarettes do you smoke every day, how often or do you share your cigarettes, how how long does it take for you after you wake up to smoke a cigarette, right? There can be all these different questions relating to smoking. And this is known as the pretest. Also, it's also a dependent variable, right? Because this is the dependent variable measure, but we're giving it as a pretest. So we get their smoking measure. We also know that this is happening at time 1. Then they have the training program, right? So then everybody gets the training program. And then at the end of the 4-week training program, that dependent variable is assessed again at time 2. It's the same smoking measure with those same types of questions. How many packs of cigarettes do you smoke a day? How many cigarettes do you have at one time? How often do you share your cigarettes? Whatever it might be. Okay? Now you can make a comparison here between the pretest time 1 and the post-test score time 2. So ultimately, the training program would like to see a change in the smoking measure. They're hoping that maybe the smoking measure was really high, like on a score of 1 to 100. Maybe people are getting about a 70 and above on average. But they're hoping that this training program, that smoking measure or that smoking cessation through that measure will show us that they've actually have reduced scores, perhaps hopefully 50 or below. So you're able to make a comparison, but only between the pre-test dependent variable and the post-test dependent variable, between time 1 and time 2. But again, you're not making a comparison between two different groups of people. Now, here's where we can start to add two different groups. This non-equivalent, again, they're non-equivalent because you have not randomly assigned them. You have not taken a group of people from the population you've randomly selected and randomly assigned them. We don't know if they're equivalent or not. We don't know if each group has about the same equivalence because we didn't randomly assign them. So we call them non-equivalent control group design, and a comparison exists between two groups, but again, no randomization takes place. But the great news is you absolutely do have a participants here, and then you have a group of participants here. Typically, they're two convenient groups, again, classroom A and classroom B, but ultimately the great news is you can somewhat have an experimental group. So you basically have an experimental group who was given that training program, that independent variable, that 4-week smoking cessation training program. And then you can also claim that these are the control group because now you have these second participants, they got no training program. And in the end, what you're doing is you're measuring their smoking behaviors and see if the training program had an effect. And here you're able to make a comparison between these two groups. So you essentially do have an experimental group and a control group, but what you don't have is randomization. So you have one group that was given the training program, they're the experimental group. The second group did not get a training program. They're considered the control group. And then you assess them both on the smoking measure, and then you compare the differences between these two measures. And again, they're not randomly assigned because typically they're just two convenient groups of people. Another non-equivalent group, again, we cannot confirm that they're even equivalent. We don't know. There might be something very drastically different between this group and this group because of non-randomization. But this adds another layer that sort of supports the research to be even stronger. So even though they're non-equivalent groups, you can still do a non-equivalent control group pre-test, post-test design. And again, time 1, in time 2, you have these participants who are part of the experimental group, right, who are given that measure. Then, of course, the independent variable, the treatment they're given, and then you can assess the outcomes on that smoking measure, that dependent variable post-test at time 2. And then you also have a second set of participants who are your control group. And this control group, again, you have one group that has the treatment, here, and the second group who does not have the treatment. That control group, you assess and measure their smoking behaviors at time 1, but they're not getting the treatment, but you still are able to assess their smoking behaviors at time 2. And again, what you're really doing is making a comparison between the experimental group who received the smoking cessation intervention program and the group or the control group who did not receive the intervention, and you're trying to see what their smoking behaviors are on this particular measure. And you're trying to look at the comparative differences between these two groups. So this allows for a little bit more control. This is also a mixed design because you can see you have repeated measures because both your groups are taking it at time 1 and time 2, but it's also between groups because you're assessing the differences between these two groups, those who received the intervention and those who did not. Now, there are the threats to internal validity that can happen with quasi-experimental design, history effects. The event occurs at the same time as experimental manipulation. So in other words, some type of major event in history, 9/11, for example, the current even pandemic is another example that can have an effect on the experimental manipulation. Maturation effects, we know that people have to be in the study over a period of time, especially with the pre-test condition, the treatment intervention, then a post-test condition. I mean, that can easily be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. So maturation effects, changes within each individual happen over time. So that can play a role. Testing effects, once a person gets a measure, they do some type of an intervention, they somewhat figure out what you're trying to assess, especially when they're given the post-test a second time around. They're aware of what's being tested, and so therefore they're going to alter their behavior because of the testing effects. Instruments can decay over time. There could be changing characteristics of the measure over time. So for instance, you thought you had a group of people who were smokers and you have this really great smoking cessation measure intervention program. You have this great smoking behaviors measure, but maybe during this time is when vaping starts to really go on the rise and people start to throw away their cigarettes and start want to vape. And so therefore your smoking behavior measure isn't that valid anymore, because now you really need a measure on vaping. There's also an issue of regression toward the mean, which this cartoon also describes here. A regression towards the mean is basically if someone on their score gets really high score on the pretest or a very low score on the pretest, guess what's going to happen to their post-test? There's going to be a natural change in the score that regresses towards the mean with extremely high or extremely low scores. There's nowhere to go but up or down. So if you have a pretest that's a really high score, almost to the maximum score of that pretest smoking measure, guess what? It can't get any higher, so it's only going to go low. And same thing with an extreme low score. It can't get any lower. It can only slightly go higher, and it's going to regress towards the mean. So those are threats to internal validity for these quasi-experimental designs. But the advantages of these quasi-experimental designs is even though you can't randomly assign and randomly select people, you can still pull a convenience sample. You can still have two people in two different groups, these control groups. You can still make some comparison conditions to interpret the results. You can actually identify the effect of the independent variable manipulation because you have one group that received that independent variable as part of the treatment and the other group did not. So you can still identify some type of an effect that the independent variable may have had on the dependent variable or the outcomes, right? And it does support internal validity. As long as you add this control group in quasi-experimental designs, then you're not, you're doing the best that you can as a researcher, especially with special conditions, especially like today with COVID experiences. It must be really difficult for researchers to actually randomly select and assign people. In fact, even at our university has shut down any face-to-face research experiences. We can't conduct any face-to-face research, so we're at a limitation. But quasi-experimental survey designs are things that we still can do. So we can do a survey design and disseminate our surveys out to the public through social media and through online internet sources. Yet at the same time, we can still create these control groups and experimental groups based on what we put out in surveys. So we're able to do some things that continue to support internal validity. Now, when it comes to developmental research, very briefly, there's three different designs for developmental research. Developmental research is trying to understand the changes and differences in maturation that occur over time. When we think about developmental psychology, developmental psychologists are interested in changes, physical growth changes, psychological changes that happen over time, social developmental changes that are happening over time, cognitive changes that are happening over time, emotional changes that are happening over time. And so developmental researchers are interested in looking at sort of how time and growth and age and maturation changes you in any one of these developmental domains: cognitive, biological, social, etc., etc. So the cross-sectional method is pretty interesting because what you get here is you get three different groups of people who are from three different cohorts, and you assess them all at the same time. In this case, let's say it was 2020, let's not say 2010, 2020. You get a cohort of people who were born in 1955 that are currently 55 years old, and you assess them on the same exact cognitive experience. Then you get group two, people who are born in 1950, at this point would be about 70 years old now, and you want to assess them at that time, and maybe you want to do a cognitive assessment. And same thing with group three, and you want to see what is the difference from people born in 1945. So ultimately, with a cohort, which is a group of individuals with common features, so everybody born in 1955, 50, or 45, or what have you. And you assess them all, and these are your three different groups, and you assess them on the same measure, and then you look for the differences in cognition of 55-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 65-year-olds, right? So let's say you wanted to measure the differences in 55, 60, and 65-year-olds in cognition because you're trying to understand the cognitive changes that are happening over time developmentally. Then you would look at these cross-sectional methods where at one time point you can get a group of three different cohorts of people and assess them on the same measure. Now, the longitudinal method, you only using one group. Okay, and in this case, you might have a cohort of people that were born in the same year, 1955, and then you assess them at time one when they're 55, at time two when they're 60, and at time three when they're 65 years of age. So here, this study takes a much longer time because the longitudinal method, you only have one group, and you literally are trying to look at these cognitive changes in adulthood over time, and it takes you 10 years to get this data. Where a cross-sectional design, it actually only took you 1 year, just in that same exact time period, could have just been in 2 weeks. You captured people in your cohorts that were born in 55, 50, and 45, and you had them all take a cognitive assessment, and now you can see the differences that are happening across these age spans. The longitudinal method, again, you only have one group, and it takes a lot longer to get the end result. Now, the sequential method is a combination of both the cross-sectional and longitudinal method. So here you can see cross-sectional because we have two different cohorts, but these two cohorts, again, the year of birth cohort, you're also evaluating them over time. So in this case, again, over a 10-year period, you're looking at these cognitive changes, and people are being assessed at each one of these time periods: time one assessment, time two assessment, time three assessment, but instead of a single group, you also have a second group. So now you're really looking at changes in cognition between the ages of 55 to 75 years of age. So we're able to add an extra year here. Developmental research designs, again, some differences between these two. Longitudinal designs, as we said, can take a lot longer. Anything takes longer, is much more expensive, very costly. Can attribute change to development over time very, very well. But with cross-sectional design, less expensive. Your comparisons can be obtained fairly quickly, literally even within a 2 to 3 week period once you coordinate everything. And instead of really saying, oh, these are absolute developmental changes that are over time, you have to make more like inferences. You're inferring the differences of developmental changes, and that's really the challenge. Here you can say, aha, I did a longitudinal design with the same people over 10 years, and I can attribute these changes to development. Here you can't do that. You can only make inferences. Cohort effect, like I said before, just a group of people who have a similar commonality, those born at the same time, not only typically born at the same time, but typically exposed to the same events and demographic changes or trends. So, in other words, economic and political conditions could be the same, music and art experiences, educational systems, child rearing practices, etc., etc. The cohort effect tends to affect cross-sectional designs more than longitudinal designs. So you do need to be careful for this because there might be something very specific that's happening within that particular cohort that you think it's just about cognition, but it may not be. Maybe there was something happening in the educational systems with one of those cohorts that was very, very different than another cohort. And so maybe these cognitive differences are really due to something that was happening in the educational systems rather than the actual developmental cognitive changes. Okay, that is the end, everyone.